It seems much of the Western world turns to science for answers rather than to faith. But can faith and science coexist, get along with each other? Today's guest has some ideas on the subject. Dr. Andy Walsh is a molecular biologist and author of Faith Across the Multiverse, Parables from Modern Science. Andy, welcome to Bridge City News.
Hi, thanks for having me, Hal.
Now you say that you hope the book will introduce readers to God and that science can actually coexist and maybe science can help in the process. How so?
Yeah, so the idea in this book in particular is to use the language and the concepts of contemporary science to talk about Christian theology, to talk about ideas from the Bible, as a way to maybe introduce those to folks who aren't familiar with the Bible or haven't had the opportunity to read it for themselves, and even for Christians who might be familiar to talk about these things that in a new way, to maybe help them think about things like God's grace or the nature of Jesus and his divine and human nature, things like that, in a new way by using new language and new metaphors for them.
Now, you make quite an interesting statement as well. You do not have faith in religion. Can you explain that?
Sure. So it's not that my faith in the practice of Christianity or the traditions of Christianity so much as faith in the person of Jesus Christ for ultimate salvation. Right, so that's who I'm ultimately interested in following, and who I'm ultimately interested in introducing other people to is Jesus of Nazareth, and the God that I believe that He incarnated and who we meet through the Bible. And so the Bible is a good way to get to know the person of Jesus, but that ultimately He's the one that we're trying to get to know better.
Now, you're right that your belief in God is informed by historical corroboration of the Bible. Can you give an example or two?
Sure. So we have, archaeological evidence of different events in the Old Testament, various of the kings of Israel and Judah and so forth. Certainly, the captivity and the various empires that are mentioned in the Old Testament, match up with lots of other historical records. Then there's also, evidence of the life of Jesus of Nazareth himself from other sources outside of the Bible, and certainly other events that are mentioned in the Bible related to who was in charge, who was ruling for the Roman Empire and so forth at that time. So there are reasons to think that the texts were written by folks who lived during that era and were familiar with what was going on.
Why do you say the work of faith is to discern the meaning and what we observe in the world around us?
Okay, so one of the early chapters in the book talks about the concept of faith and relates it to mathematics and the mathematics of information and communication. And so communication and information theory is something studied in math, but we don't have so much a model for what a message means, so much as measuring the size of the message, or how much of a file size or how much of a bandwidth we need to communicate a particular message. Meaning is something different. It tends to be relational. It requires that both parties, the sender of the message and the receiver of the message, agree on some common meaning and some common way of interpreting that. And so, as a Christian believer, our faith is part of our faith is accepting a common meaning with God, that God is trying to communicate some meaning through the Bible, and that we're trying to find that shared meaning with Him by entering into a relationship with Him and interpreting the Bible and interpreting the natural world as His creation in a way that is consistent with the meaning that He intends to communicate.
Now, you break your book into 4 different sections. What are they, and why did you choose them?
Yeah, so the 4 sections deal with the language of mathematics, with physics, with biology, and with computer science. And I chose them for a couple of reasons. First, those are the areas of science that I was most familiar with, partly through my formal academic training in biology and later in computer science, and also areas that I was just familiar with from having read a lot of books sort of as a side hobby. I also felt that it was a helpful progression going from abstract ideas from mathematics through to more concrete ideas and encountering the actual physical world in physics and biology. And then computer science deals a lot with practical questions of how do we accomplish particular tasks.
Now, can you explain exactly what you mean by God calls us to balance justice and mercy, Andy?
Sure. So that's from another early chapter from the section on the language of math, dealing with how the concept of optimization can help us to understand things like sin and obedience. And so the question becomes, what are we trying to optimize? What are we trying to make the most of in the world? And it seems like 2 important such concepts are justice and mercy. So justice being the idea that fairness, that if somebody does something wrong, that there is some accountability for that, some sort of either punishment or reconciliation or restoration that needs to be accomplished. And also mercy, the idea that we, show some leniency to people that have done something wrong, that we don't punish them to the full extent of the law or what have you. And so balancing those two things, we don't want there to be no justice in the world, but we also don't want there to be no mercy. And so finding some combination of those two things that is optimal seems to be what the Bible is calling us towards.
Why do you call a gracious universe one in which life is possible?
Okay, so that deals with the idea that chaos mathematics, the idea of things having sensitivity to their initial starting conditions, but also having some notion of being attracted to a particular stable pattern, not a particular stable point, but a dynamic stability, a pattern that recurs over time, that is an illustration of grace and God's grace. And we see a lot of systems in the actual world, both physical systems and biological systems, that exhibit this kind of chaotic attractor pattern, where dynamically the system will change over time, but it will tend to stay in a particular pattern that is stable. One example is our heartbeat, actually. The pattern of cells contracting, the nerve cells and the muscle cells working together exhibits that kind of behavior, where if one nerve cell or muscle cell gets a little bit out of sync, goes a little bit too early or too late, it'll tend back towards a synchronized setting so that your heart is pumping consistently and all those cells are working together to pump your blood, as opposed to getting out of sync and then just getting further and further out of sync and becoming completely disordered. So that tendency for the system to come back to a stable, ordered, consistent pattern is what makes life possible and is best modeled by this kind of chaos theory mathematics. And that's just one example of many where that kind of pattern of grace, that tendency of the system to come back to something stable, is exhibited in actual systems in nature. And so it seems to be a feature of the universe that does, in fact, make life possible on all different scales.
Now, you're right that the life of Jesus challenges our popular notions of what is significant or distinct about humanity. How so?
Sure. So, talking about Jesus, one of the things that we like to say a lot is that to err is human, right, and to forgive is divine. And I was thinking in particular when I wrote that of a movie in which that's kind of the rallying cry of the hero of the film, is that humans are going to make mistakes. Yet Jesus seems to live a perfect life, or at least that's part of Christian tradition, is that Jesus lives this perfect life, and yet is also fully human. So maybe that kind of capacity, we might have the capacity to make mistakes, but it's not necessarily a necessary part of the human condition, but simply an observed part of the human condition.
Living here in southern Alberta, Andy, we're very blessed because we can go hiking in the beautiful southern Rockies. I'm a big fan of that myself. How is the natural world a true signal from God?
Yeah, so as a Christian, we certainly believe that, I believe that God created the world and that it expresses some sort of his intentions for what he thinks is good and beautiful and worthwhile. And so the kinds of things that flourish over time in that creation are, I think, an indication of the things that are important to God. And so, we see in our experience that life flourishes, that love flourishes, that love is something that, is possible in the universe and that seems to grow over time, that the more you show love, the more the love there is in the world as opposed to diminishing. And, same with life. Life seems to be growing in abundance and in diversity over time. And so I think those things reflect the character of God and reflect the kinds of priorities that God has of what he would like to see more of.
Now, you say it's fairly easy to assess ourselves by what is going on around us, becoming a product of our environment. How do we get away from that tendency?
Yeah, so I think that that's part of the value of being involved in something like the Christian tradition and the Christian church, is having accountability to other people and having accountability to the examples in the Bible. So you have some sort of external reference that you're looking to for a model of what is ethical behavior, what is moral behavior, what is the good and true way to live.
Now, your book also has a chapter on the Entropic Principle. Can you explain exactly what that is?
Okay, sure. So entropy is a concept from physics, and it deals with it's often described as the tendency of things to tend towards disorder over time. But a slightly more helpful way of thinking about it is the balance between symmetry and asymmetry, so things becoming more symmetrical over time, meaning that you can swap around the parts and not tell the difference at a sort of large scale that you made any sort of changes, that those little changes don't matter. So the more asymmetrical something is, the less entropy it has. And living systems, such as ourselves, show a high degree of asymmetry with respect to entropy. And so the Entropic Principle chapter talks about that we're called to be living sacrifices, that we're called to sort of set our lives down to follow Christ and on behalf of other people. And so taking those things that make our lives asymmetrical and ordered and allow our own lives to proceed and sharing those with other people, maybe even taking on some amount of disorder or symmetry in our own lives so that we can share life with other people in big and small ways.
You talk about the idea of the Bible as a genome of the church. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so the genome is a concept from biology. We're talking about the sum total of the DNA sequences in all of our individual cells. Every cell in your body has a complete copy of your genome. They're all essentially identical, and they're all unique to you. But each cell has its own copy, and each cell is expressing that genome in different ways. So not every gene that genome encodes is expressed by every cell all the time, but they're expressing different genes at different times. That's what makes your different cell types in different parts of your body different. Similarly, the Bible is the full message of how the church, where the Christian tradition gets all of its doctrine from and ideas from, theology from. But no single person is expressing that entire Bible all at once. Even though we all have access to the same Bible, we're all referring to the same Bible, we're going to be expressing different parts of that Bible at different times in our own lives and corporately as different church communities. And so it kind of just has that same sort of function of informing what we do, but not being able to, but each person expressing it uniquely or bringing it to life uniquely. And so it's the sum total of the whole church over time that expresses the entirety of the Bible rather than any individual person at any given moment.
Now, Andy, when the Bible talks about man reflecting the true image of God, what does that mean? Does that mean that you and I look exactly like God, created in the image of our Heavenly Father?
Right. So in the Christian tradition, we don't think that God has a physical self in that same way. So it's not so much that we are physically resembling God, but more that we have been called to represent Him on earth as a ambassador. Some people use that word or something like that, and that there may be certain characteristics of how we live our lives or how we interact with each other that reflect God's principles or personality or priorities. And so, for example, we believe that God exists in a Trinity, and so there's some relational nature to God in and of Himself. And we see that same relational nature expressed in the church. That Christianity isn't fully expressed, as we just talked about in the genome concept. Christianity isn't fully expressed by any one person living their own life by themselves. Christianity and the Bible are fully expressed in a community of a church, and so that relational aspect of our Christian faith, it reflects some aspect of God and is an image of God, at least, if not the full expression of what we mean by the image of God.
Now, in your book, you refer to the Creator as a just-in-time God. Can you explain that?
Sure. So that just-in-time is a concept from computer science. It talks about how we take computer code that humans have written and translate it into machine instructions that a computer can actually execute. The first kinds of compilers did that all in advance. So you would write a computer program, and then you would send it to the computer to compile, and then you could run that program over and over again. More recently, we've developed systems where you can actually run a program as you're typing, as it's going along. You can execute each instruction individually. And then just-in-time compilation is a balance between the two, where you write the code in advance, but the computer is translating it into machine instructions as it goes, and translating different parts of it just when they're needed to be used. And so it's an efficient balance sort of between the two notions. And that kind of pattern seems to be something that we see in the Bible, where God is expressing intentions in advance, but the way that they are realized in particular circumstances sometimes are adjusted to account for the particulars of those circumstances, the choices that individual humans might make, and so forth. And so there's this balance between God having an intention that is expressed for all of time and how that intention is realized by the circumstances of individual lives. That seems to be conceptually kind of similar to that just-in-time idea.
Now, you write that simplifying the Ten Commandments were a way for God to provide order and information sharing. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so right there's a challenge of communication. A big part of the Bible is just for God to express Himself to us, to get across ideas that we otherwise wouldn't know about Him. Right? We don't have direct experience of God. We don't have the same kinds of experiences God experienced because we have a different sort of body. We have a physical reality that's different from God's experience, and so God has to find ways to communicate across that experience gap to us. And things like the Ten Commandments represent different parts of God's communication and a way of expressing His intentions and His desire to know us and to be known by us.
Dr. Andy Walsh, a molecular biologist and author of Faith Across the Multiverse, Parables for Modern Science. Thanks for joining me today from Pennsylvania.
Sure, you're welcome. Thanks for having me, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.